Good afternoon. I'm Lee Fletcher McGuckin, Dean of Students at the school, and I'm happy to extend a warm welcome to our upper school juniors and new seniors, to the many friends of Principia who are with us today in the audience, and to those of you who are joining us on Principia Internet Radio. Today we'll hear from two long-time faculty members at the school, Mr. Howard Bay and Mr. Clark Bimesha. They'll speak to us about the most important documents ever written in the history of our nation, the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. Mr. Bay is chair of the Social Studies Department and currently teaches economics and American history here at the school. As a graduate of lower, middle, and upper schools, plus Principia College, he is in his 38th year as a faculty and staff member. However, if you were to add in his student years, this is his 50th year on campus. As Howie likes to say, he's halfway there. Clark Bimesha, a Northwestern graduate, began teaching at Principia in 1972. In 2008, he won the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum's Creative Teaching Award. Since his retirement in 2010, Clark has continued to teach classes at Principia College's summer session. He has served as faculty on Principia lifelong learning cruises up the Rhine and to Holland, and coming up in this September, a riverboat cruise on the Mississippi. For the past few years, Clark and his wife, Carol, have been traveling the country to visit the homes, museums, and libraries of every past president. His new book, titled Calling on the Presidents, Tales Their Houses Tell, is now available both in print and in ebook. Mr. Bimesha will speak about the Declaration of Independence, and Mr. Bay will speak on the Bill of Rights. These speeches, as well as the documents our students will receive afterwards, are a gift from Donald and Christina Koch of the Koch Foundation, whose mission is to help students keep ever fresh in mind the priceless legacy of liberty, which we've all inherited. I'd like to have Don and Christina Koch please stand so we can thank them. They've been very generous with their gift of doing this for many years for us. And now, please welcome Mr. Bimesha and Mr. Howard Bay to the stage.
Thank you very much, Lee. As Mrs. Fletcher McGuckin indicated, I've been doing quite a bit of thinking about houses. So I'm going to start with a house. In 1775, a man named Jacob Graf was a bricklayer and a house builder in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And he decided that he could solve two problems with one solution. His family needed a home, and he wanted to advertise. And so he walked west on Market Street to the very edge of town where there were lots of open fields and green trees, and he built this brick house, both as a residence for his family and as an advertisement for his skills as a mason. This house stood at 7th and Market Street for over 100 years. Here's a later picture of it. Until it was finally torn down in 1883 as the city of Philadelphia had in fact grown past it. Now, that's not all that unusual, but this is. In 1975, 200 years after its original building, the National Park Service bought the land on which it had originally been placed and rebuilt this facsimile of the house. Why? Probably because of what was happening several blocks further east in toward town on Market Street. Specifically in this building, which we've come to know as Independence Hall. The Second Continental Congress was meeting there, and 1776, the next year, was a very rough year. The British controlled Boston. You know this from your history. There had been battles at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. And the Second Continental Congress created what I think is probably the greatest single committee that's ever been formed. 5 of its delegates, and they came from all over the new nation. So John Adams from Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin from Philadelphia, he was right at home. Thomas Jefferson, Southerner from Virginia. Roger Sherman from Connecticut. Robert R. Livingston from New York. And these men were given the task of coming up with a document that would be sent to England to tell England that the colonies were going to be no longer colonies. They would become a separate nation. This committee very wisely decided that an effort of 5 people to write a document like this would be a futile task. And so they chose the man they knew was the best writer among them, Thomas Jefferson, and said, "You make the draft, and then we'll look at it." Jefferson realized that this was a momentous moment for his country, and he wanted to be quiet. He wanted to have peace. And so he started looking around for some place where he could write. And he walked west down Market Street until he saw the Jacob Graff house. Knocking on the door, he learned that in fact, the second floor of this house was for rent. And so he rented it. And for the next month or so, he stayed there. We can visit this house today, or this reconstructed house. You walk around the back and walk up the stairs, and you can see the room where he wrote and lived and slept. In this place, at this time, he came up with the draft of the document that you are going to receive a beautiful, frameable copy of today. At the start, it must have struck him as a pretty easy task. You see the beginning of the declaration here. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary to dissolve the political bonds which have connected 2 areas, and one to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A deep respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes. That's a very fancy way of saying, you probably wonder why we're separating from you, England. We'll tell you. And of course, Thomas Jefferson probably had among his various books a copy of this very important 46-page pamphlet that everybody was reading in 1776. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. In that book, Paine had written, "It's the violence which is done, remember Boston, threatened to our persons, the destructions of our property by an armed force, the invasion of our country by fire and sword, which conscientiously qualifies the use of arms. And the instant that such a mode of defense became necessary, all subjection to Britain ought to have ceased." In other words, as soon as guns were fired, we should have declared our independence. Well, Thomas Jefferson certainly would have agreed with that, and he writes in the center of his document a great list of the injustices, the unfairnesses that had been imposed upon the American people in the colonies. So it would seem as if he'd finished. There it was. He had listed the colony's complaints. He had given an explanation for why it was that we should be separated from England. But he must have been dissatisfied, and importantly so. Somehow, what he had done wasn't quite enough. And why not? As he sat in that relatively pleasant room, although it was probably hot in Philadelphia in June, he had to be wrestling with a bigger question than any of the ones he'd already considered. How could any new nation, even the one for which he was calling in this document, avoid becoming just as unjust as England had become? How do you start something new that's totally different from anything that exists? At some point, he had to realize that the real problem wasn't even separation. The problem was government itself and what people understood government to be. And there, if he'd looked back in his common sense, he would have seen that Thomas Paine articulated what to many people was a typical explanation of government. Paine writes in that book, government is a badge of lost innocence. In other words, when you're innocent, you don't need government. But we've lost our innocence, so we need it. Society, that is, people being together in every state, is a blessing. But government, in its best state, is but a necessary evil. Or my personal favorite, society is produced by our wants, and government is produced by our weaknesses. That cynical attitude, which actually sounds pretty modern, doesn't it? Jefferson had to be thinking, somehow, what we're creating here has to reverse those cynical observations about government. And so one by one, he actually took Paine's ideas and turned them on its head. Instead of defining man as a tragically lost innocent, he started with the most famous words in this document. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are not lost innocents. They're created equal. They're endowed by their Creator, God, with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, by which, and I ask you to think about this a little bit because that last one is the one that confuses us sometimes. Obviously, life is important. Liberty, yes. But Jefferson isn't talking about just enjoying oneself, except in the highest sense of that. The pursuit of happiness meant to him that you could become whatever you were capable of becoming. Nothing makes us happier than being able to live up to our full potential without restrictions or constraints. It's a very different view of man. He continued, instead of government being simply a necessary evil, he said that to secure these rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men. And then the kicker, deriving their just powers, consent, not of a king, not of a parliament, but from the governed, us. Nobody had talked like this before. That the purpose of government is to secure our unalienable rights and that we consent to the government as opposed to having it imposed upon us? And if that wasn't radical enough, then he says, instead of being produced by our weaknesses, the government he was calling for should be forever subject to the strength of its citizens. Look at this. Imagine King George reading this little phrase. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, that is, securing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, putting its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such a form as to them shall seem to affect their safety and happiness. That thinking was unbelievably new. This document now had outgrown its original intent to list grievances and to explain the need for separation. This document was a declaration, both of independence, yes, but more importantly, of the birth of a new form of government. Not one based on human weakness, but a government of, for, and by its own citizens. This was more than a document, it was a revolution. It not only marked the beginning of military action, it talked about profoundly changed thought. The document you'll be getting is a testament to what Jefferson thought through. And I would argue that as he thought, he realized that everything that had made the government bad had been its emphasis on dependency. And everything that he longed for was bound with the words of independent. If you don't have a free economy, if you depend on your mother country, as the mercantile system insisted that the colonies do, you're dependent. If you can't really defend yourself, if one of the first things the government of Britain wanted to do when they were concerned about the upheaval is to take arms away from people, you're dependent. Jefferson said, I choose independent. And I argue for you that because of that choice and because of this remarkable document, the National Park Service rebuilt the place where it had been conceived. Renaming it, not the Joseph Groff House, but the Declaration House. Because it was here that Thomas Jefferson thought his way through to a radically different form of government. But he also realized something. This choice between dependence and independence, between dependency and independence, was not resolved in 1776. It was envisioned. We know what he chose. But I think he probably also realized in his heart of hearts that the choice between dependency and independence would be a choice that every generation would have to make for itself. There are things about dependency which are very, very tempting. And there are things about independence which seem daunting. He chose independence. What will you choose? Think about this quietly. Think about it often. And choose well. Thank you very much. That's all.
Well, there's our man, Thomas Jefferson. It would seem that Thomas Jefferson is the man of the hour. I think everyone in the auditorium received a copy of Light and Liberty. When our visiting scholar, Eric Peterson, spoke here back in January, over half the students here may remember going down to the Jefferson Memorial, and we saw the Louisiana Purchase documents on loan from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And we just heard a very thought-provoking tribute to Thomas Jefferson and the first principles contained in the Declaration of Independence from my colleague, Mr. Beim. So now let's pick up the story 11 years later. It's 1787. The war's over. independence achieved, but just what shape the new nation would take, no one could truly say. Fortunately, some of the men who had signed the Declaration back in 1776 had agreed to return to Philadelphia. Washington was there, so was Benjamin Franklin. And there were some new younger representatives, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. The gathering included governors, generals, judges, businessmen, financiers, plantation owners, physicians, and attorneys. And they were all committed to safeguarding the rights of Americans as named in the Declaration. I love what Governor Samuel Hutchinson of Connecticut, what he had to say about the convention. Heretofore, most governments have been formed by tyrants and imposed on mankind by force. Never did a people in time of peace and tranquility meet together by their representatives and with calm deliberation frame for themselves a system of government. What he was saying is that for much of history, rulers mostly governed through fear. There were no citizens, just subjects. But the founding fathers believed that government based on the threat of violence was illegitimate and unjust. What men like Washington and Madison sought to create was a government of laws, not of men, where all citizens were equal before the law and where the government's authority derives solely from the consent of the governed. Now, some political observers of the time believed that once the majority of people had elected their lawmakers, few restrictions on their power was necessary. After all, they were vested with the consent of the governed. But the founding fathers, most of them, rejected this line of thinking, believing, as we've already heard from Thomas Paine in Common Sense, that government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil and should be strictly limited in its power to its proper purpose of protecting our individual liberties and providing security for its citizens. In fact, James Madison, who would later be known as the father of the Constitution, admitted that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So it was that 55 men came together in the summer of 1787 to hammer out a document that really has no parallel in human history. The Constitution that they would write would revolutionize government by creating 3 separate branches, one for lawmaking, one for the executive branch, and another for the judicial branch. And they drew up a host of other groundbreaking ideas, such as a bicameral Congress and a system of checks and balances, so that one branch could not dominate the government and become oppressive. Most importantly, it would be the supreme law of the land, adopted by the people, a written constitution with limited enumerated powers, meaning if it wasn't on the list, then it wasn't one of the powers. The legislators would be elected directly by the people, and there would be frequent and set elections to ensure that the representatives constantly embodied the wishes of the voters. And every citizen, even the judges and the legislators and the military officers, even the president, was bound to follow the Constitution and the laws of the land. Now, the final document left room for future legislators to make changes. We know these as amendments. But the Constitution, as it was submitted to the states for approval, appeared to be the work of genius, or as Thomas Jefferson would call them, the assembly of demigods. And yet, to the consternation of these men in Philadelphia, there turned out to be a substantial number of very vocal opponents to the Constitution, men like Patrick Henry, who tried to convince a large percentage of the population not to approve the Constitution. What were their doubts? What were their objections based on? And how would they be resolved? Which brings us back to the man of the hour, Thomas Jefferson. Now you might ask, what was Jefferson's contribution to our second founding document, the Constitution of the United States? What role did he play? We know he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Did he also author the stirring opening line of the preamble, "We the people"? Did he debate the pros and cons of a bicameral legislature or separation of powers with its checks and balances, or maybe the veto power of the president? Well, the answer is none of the above. Jefferson was out of the country. He was in Paris. He'd been appointed minister to France in 1787, and so he could only secretly monitor the progress of the convention through letters, which he received from his close friend, James Madison. And yet he did play a critical role in getting the Constitution ratified. He understood that these opponents to the Constitution had one thing in common. They didn't trust the central government. They didn't trust it to limit itself to only those powers given to it by the Constitution. So despite all the safeguards inserted into the document, there were actually no written guarantees protecting individual liberty. This is what the Revolution had been fought for, and Jefferson understood this. So when Madison sent him a copy of the final draft of the Constitution, Jefferson immediately knew what was missing. And here is his reply, Jefferson's reply to Madison. "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, and what no just government should refuse. The Constitution should clearly provide for freedom of religion, freedom of the press, protection against standing armies, trials by jury." It's on page 73 of your book. The men who drafted the Constitution had argued against this idea that they had to put these rights in writing. For them, the Constitution did not reserve any such power to restrict these freedoms, so there was no reason to try to list them all. In their minds, the government was only permitted to do those things specifically mentioned in the Constitution. So why try to come up with a list of things that it could not do? But Jefferson was right, and Madison knew it. To get the states to ratify the Constitution and make it that supreme law of the land, Madison would have to add a Bill of Rights, which we know as the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And I think for most people today, it is the Constitution. I mean, especially the First Amendment, which specifically speaks about our freedoms, freedom of the speech, freedom of press, of religion. But I think what people today forget is that the Bill of Rights is not a list of rights given to us by the government. Our elected representatives do not grant us freedom of speech. Our government does not confer upon us freedom of religion or freedom of the press. These are God-given rights, unalienable rights. They do not permit us the right to assemble or to bear arms, trial by jury, obtain legal counsel to defend ourselves. A careful reading of the Bill of Rights makes it clear that Congress shall make no law prohibiting these freedoms. So what's the history lesson here? Let's take a look at the evidence. Madison and Jefferson believed the Bill of Rights didn't grant new rights to the people. On the contrary, it prohibited the federal government from taking away the freedoms the people had just won in the Revolution. Let's fast forward and see Madison's Constitution is still operating today, and the Bill of Rights remains the cornerstone of our liberty. And can we all agree that the United States, founded on these first principles, outlined in the Declaration of Independence, is today the most wealthy and powerful nation in history? That despite our shortcomings, America has no superior in manufacturing or engineering or design, agriculture, finance, technology, research, military might, etc., and that this greatness actually springs from the work of free citizens. In light of our apparent economic, cultural, and military dominance in the world, should we consider America to be all but invincible? That whatever serious threats we face will likely come from outside our borders? From terrorists or rogue nations that have nuclear weapons? Not so fast, you say. These are bold claims, but recent polls tell us the American people have a different view on what is worrying them. More than terrorism, more than global warming, illegal immigration, race relations, Obamacare. For the past 2 years, the Gallup poll cites that the number one problem facing America, and it wasn't even close, getting between 15 and 20% of the votes, was weak government leadership. All the others I mentioned received less than 5%. In other words, the American people are not happy with the government, and they see its leadership as by far and away the most serious problem that we face. How can this be? Aren't there more dangerous issues to the nation? Could it be that the people are just misinformed? Isn't the government doing the best it can? Is it possible the government's trying to do too much? How do we answer these questions? Do the people not know enough? Do we not know how to be good citizens? Do we know how the government works so that we can hold our Congress and our president accountable? Okay, everyone here, ask yourself, how well do you know your rights? Did you know that the Bill of Rights contains 462 words? It can be read in only a matter of minutes. And yet, it embraces the wisdom of the ages. It expressly checks the power of the federal government. In fact, its very purpose is to place our fundamental rights beyond the reach of officials and elections. Over the last generation, the amount of time high schools dedicate to social studies and civics has plummeted. Studies show that young people do not understand what it means to be a citizen. These studies say that you are disengaged from the political process and that you lack an appreciation for American democracy. For instance, according to recent test scores, only 13% of high school seniors are considered proficient in American history, and over half fell below the basic level. Even at the college level, nearly 80% of seniors at 55 top universities, including Harvard and Princeton, when given a high school American history test, received a D or an F. Most concerning is that your generation is being accused of having only a limited knowledge of what is necessary for effective self-government. And you are our future leaders, our judges, our future educators, soldiers, managers, workers, volunteers, and voters. One can only guess how the men who framed our Constitution in 1787 would react to our popular understanding of their work. It appears most Americans don't understand the Constitution, and many are confused by the Bill of Rights. Which brings us back to light and liberty. On page 114, Jefferson warns us, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. So how about it, Principia? Do you know your rights? Well, I asked my history classes this question in the simplest way I could think of. I surprised them, gave them no warning, and I asked them to name the fundamental freedoms guaranteed to them in the First Amendment. Can you do it? Can you name all 5? Well, freedom of speech That's the number one answer, always. And then freedom of religion usually follows. Freedom of the press. You know what's next? Freedom of assembly, that's a harder one. And the hardest one is freedom of petition. The petition to redress of grievances. Okay, well, before I share with you how we did, you might like to see the results of a national survey. This was conducted by the McCormick Tribune Freedom Museum in Chicago. Freedom of speech. 69% of the people surveyed knew that freedom of speech was one of their First Amendment rights. Yeah, 7 out of 10. Makes me a little concerned about the other 3 people. Freedom of religion, as you can see, was 24%. 3 out of 4 people did not know that one. And I was pretty discouraged to see only 1 out of 10 could name freedom of the press. I mean, come on. It just doesn't seem possible in a free society with free public schools. Maybe the results would have been better if they'd changed the amendment from freedom of the press to maybe freedom to text or freedom to do Twitter. Freedom of assembly, also 10%. I don't know whether to be encouraged by that or not. It's people getting together. And then finally, freedom to petition for redress of grievances. Only 1 out of 100 knew that one. And all 5, only 1 out of 1,000. Now, I don't want to make light of how serious the implications are behind these numbers, but I regret to tell you that more people knew the names of the 3 judges in the American Idol than freedom of the press. And more of the people surveyed could name the 5 main characters in The Simpsons than any of the First Amendment rights, with the exception of freedom of speech. Now, the good news is that this Freedom Museum has recently transitioned. They closed their doors, and they're now a traveling exhibit that focuses on teaching the First Amendment in schools in the Chicago area. So hopefully that'll make a difference. So how did our students do with the First Amendment? You'll be pleased to hear that Principia students fared somewhat better than the rest of the country. Not surprisingly, only 1 of about 4 got freedom of assembly, and even fewer knew freedom of petition. However, as you might expect, we were pretty good on freedom of religion and freedom of the press, and we hit it out of the park on freedom of speech. Here's the results. In conclusion, I'd like to leave you with an extraordinary statement from our nation's 5th president, James Monroe. He was the last of the founding fathers, the last president who had been a founding father. And I found this very relevant comment in his inaugural address, which he delivered almost 200 years ago. He said, "It's only when the people become ignorant and corrupt that they are incapable of exercising sovereignty. Let us, by all wise and constitutional measures, promote intelligence among the people as the best means of preserving our liberties." So are we clear? The triumph of individual rights over government power is one of history's noblest themes, and the Bill of Rights epitomizes the victory. So I want to congratulate each of you here. You're about to receive your copy of the Declaration and the Bill of Rights. And I know you will not only appreciate the generosity of the Koch family in raising our awareness of these sacred documents, but I hope you'll also give silent thanks to the men who wrote them and risked everything for them, and who still speak to us, encouraging us to be responsible and active citizens. Well done, Principia. I'm proud of you. Thank you. So on behalf of the Koch Foundation, Mr. Baimesha and I invite you to form a line to the right and of the stage so that you can meet Mr. Koch and receive your copy of the documents.